Call came at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and I almost didn't pick up. I'd been asleep for maybe an hour. That deep, early sleep where your body finally lets go of the day. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I reached for it the way you do when you're half-conscious. No real thought, just reflex. The screen said it was my granddaughter, Maeve. She's 9 years old. 9-year-olds don't call their grandfathers at 11:47 on a school night unless something is wrong. I sat up before I even answered. "Grandpa?" Her voice was small. Not crying yet, but close. That specific kind of close where you can hear a child holding themselves together with everything they have. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here." "What's wrong?" A long pause. Then, "It's really dark, and I can't find the nightlight, and I don't know where Mom put it before they left." Before they left. I made her keep talking while I was already moving. Feet on the floor, light on, looking for my glasses. I asked her where she was, and she said home, in her room, and she tried to go downstairs to get some water, but she got scared in the hallway. I asked her what she'd had for dinner, and she said she found crackers in the pantry and some peanut butter, and that she'd eaten that for lunch too. That's when my chest went cold. "Maeve, honey, where are your mom and dad?" Another pause. Longer this time. "Scottsdale," she said. "They went to the resort for Dad's birthday trip." I didn't say anything for a moment. I couldn't. "They said I was old enough," she added quickly, like she was defending them, like she'd been told to believe it. "They said 9 is old enough to stay by myself for a few days." "Grandpa, am I in trouble for calling you?" "No, baby girl. You are absolutely not in trouble." I kept my voice even. I've had 61 years of practice keeping my voice even when what I actually want to do is put my fist through a wall. I stayed on the phone with her while I looked up the distance from my house in Knoxville to hers in Nashville. 3 hours and 12 minutes. I told her to go back to her room, lock her bedroom door if it made her feel safer, and keep her phone in her hand. I told her I was coming. "Tonight?" she asked. "Right now," I said. "I'm already putting on my shoes. I want to back up because there are things you need to understand about my family before any of this makes sense. My son, whose name is Garrett, is 34 years old. He's a good-looking man, always has been, got his mother's eyes and her easy smile. The kind of smile that makes people trust him before he's said 10 words. He works in commercial real estate and does well enough. When he was 29, he married a woman named Sasha, and I'll be honest with you, I tried. I really did try. Sasha is the kind of person who makes every room aware of her, not in a warm way, in the way of someone who is always keeping score, always calculating what each situation costs her and what it pays. She's sharp and she's beautiful, and she has a way of talking about other people that sounds like concern but lands like contempt. I noticed it early. I kept my mouth shut because Garrett loved her, and because I'm not the kind of father who inserts himself where he hasn't been asked. 2 years into their marriage, they had a son together, a boy they named Bryce. He's 6 now, bright as a new penny. Loud in the good way, kids are loud. I love that boy completely. Then, about a year after Bryce was born, they announced they were going to adopt. I was surprised, but I was glad. I asked Garrett about it privately, just the two of us, and he told me it had been his idea, that he'd always felt strongly about it, that Sasha was on board. He seemed genuine. He seemed like the man I raised him to be. Maeve came home when she was 7. She'd been in foster care for 2 years after her biological mother lost custody. The day they brought her home, she stood in the doorway of Garrett's house with a single backpack and looked at everything like she was trying to memorize it before someone took it away. I fell in love with her in that exact moment, completely and without any conditions attached. The first year was an adjustment, which everyone told them to expect. Maeve had some trauma responses. Night terrors, difficulty with transitions, a period where she hoarded food in her bedroom because some part of her brain still believed there wouldn't be enough. My daughter-in-law handled all of this with visible impatience. I watched her at family dinners, the way her jaw tightened when Maeve needed extra reassurance, the way she'd look at Garrett across the table with an expression that said, silently, "Can you handle this?" Garrett always handled it. I'll give him that. One-on-one with Maeve, he was patient and kind, and she adored him. But when Sasha was in the room, he became someone else. Smaller, more careful, always watching her face to gauge the temperature before he committed to anything. I'd seen that dynamic before. It doesn't get better on its own. About 8 months ago, things shifted in a way I couldn't ignore. I'd always called to speak with both kids when I checked in, but I started noticing that the calls with Bryce were long and easy, full of him telling me about his soccer games and his favorite YouTube videos, while the calls with Maeve were short and a little stilted, like she was being listened to and knew it. Once, I asked her if she wanted to come visit me for a weekend, and she got very quiet and said she'd have to ask. She called back 2 hours later and said she couldn't. They had plans, and her voice was flat in the way of a child reading from a script. I started paying closer attention. At Thanksgiving, Sasha announced that she and Garrett were planning a big birthday trip for him in late March, a long weekend at a high-end resort in Scottsdale, the kind of place with a spa and 3 pools and golf and a restaurant that charges $40 for a steak. She talked about it the way she talked about most things she cared about, with complete certainty that everyone agreed it was a wonderful idea. "Are the kids coming?" I asked. "Oh, Bryce is coming, of course," she said. "He's been so excited, but Maeve has some school thing that weekend." She said it without hesitation. Smooth. Practiced. I looked at Garrett. He was looking at his plate. I asked Maeve later, privately, if she had a school event that weekend in March. She thought about it for a moment, then shook her head. "I don't think so," she said. "Why?" I told her it was nothing. But I started making a plan. I called Garrett the first week of December. I told him I wanted to talk, just us, and he came over one Saturday morning. While Sasha was at her yoga class, we sat at my kitchen table with coffee and I asked him directly, "Was Maeve going to Scottsdale?" He looked at his coffee mug for a long time. "Sasha thinks it's better to have a focused family trip," he said finally. "Maeve has some behaviors that are still, it's hard in new environments, and Sasha doesn't want Bryce's experience to be affected." I want to tell you I stayed calm. I want to tell you I responded with measured, thoughtful words. I did, actually, but it cost me more than he probably knew. "What you're describing," I said, "is taking one of your children on a luxury vacation and leaving the other one home alone. You understand that's what you're describing." "We were going to arrange for her to..." "To what, Garrett?" "To what?" He didn't finish the sentence. He said Maeve was older than she seemed for her age, and that it was only a few days, and that he was going to leave her with food and the neighbor's number. I asked how old the neighbor was, and he said she was 73 and didn't drive anymore, and I told him that wasn't a plan. That was a liability, and he told me he'd handle it and that I didn't understand all the dynamics at play. I drove home from that conversation, and I sat in my truck in the driveway for 20 minutes before I trusted myself to go inside. I didn't call again. I just waited, and I watched the calendar, and I made my own arrangements. The drive to Nashville took me 3 hours and 8 minutes. I made good time because there was no traffic at midnight on a Tuesday, and because I drove the whole way with one hand on the wheel and the radio off. I needed the quiet. I needed to be thinking clearly when I got there. Maeve answered the door in her pajamas with the little owl print, holding her phone in both hands. She looked at me for 1 second, and then she walked directly into my arms and held on. I stood there in my son's doorway at 3 in the morning, holding a 9-year-old girl who smelled like sleep and peanut butter crackers. And I let her hold on for as long as she needed. When she finally let go, she looked up at me and said, "I didn't want to be a baby about it." "You weren't a baby," I said. "You were exactly right to call me. You did good." I went through the house with her and turned on every light. I checked the pantry. There were crackers, some apples, a half-empty box of cereal, and a case of juice boxes. That was essentially it. The refrigerator had condiments and leftover pizza from what looked like 2 days ago. I stood in front of that refrigerator for a moment, and then I closed it. I packed a bag for her. She knew where everything was. She was organized and careful about her things, the way kids are when they've learned not to take space for granted. She folded her clothes neatly before putting them in a bag, and I watched her do it. And I had to look at the wall for a minute. I left a note on the kitchen counter that said, "I have Maeve. Call me when you land." We drove to a Waffle House because she said she was hungry, and it was the only thing open. And we sat in a booth at 4 a.m. with fluorescent lights and a tired waitress who called Maeve honey and brought her hot chocolate without being asked. Maeve ate a full waffle and half of mine, and she put her head on my arm in the booth and fell asleep before we'd paid the check. I sat there for a while, just letting her sleep. My phone lit up at 7:23 a.m. It was Garrett. I let it ring. He called 3 more times in the next hour. Then Sasha called once, which surprised me. She almost never calls me directly. I didn't answer that one either. Then Garrett sent a text. "Dad, please call me." "Where is Maeve?" I texted back, "She's safe. She's with me." She was alone in the house, with crackers and a 73-year-old neighbor's phone number. "We'll talk when you're back." He called again immediately. This time I picked up. "Dad, Garrett, I need you to hear me very carefully, because I'm only going to say this once, and I need you to understand it completely. Your daughter, called me at midnight because she was scared and alone and hungry, and the only person she could think of was me. She didn't want to be a bother. She said she didn't want to be a baby, a 9-year-old child alone in a house, talking herself out of asking for help because she's been taught to make herself small. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Silence on the line. "She's safe," I continued. "She's going to stay with me. When you come home, we are going to sit down, you, me, and Sasha. And we are going to have a very serious conversation about what happens next. But right now, you're in Scottsdale, and Maeve is eating eggs at my kitchen table. And that's how it's going to be for the rest of this trip." "Dad, you can't just—" "I can," I said. And I did. "Have a good trip, son." I ended the call. I won't pretend the next 4 days were simple. Garrett called twice more. Sasha sent a text that was civil in the way of someone choosing their words very deliberately, saying she understood I had concerns, and she looked forward to discussing them as a family. I read it 3 times and then I put my phone face down on the counter. Maeve, meanwhile, did what children do when they are safe and fed, and not waiting for the next thing to go wrong. She relaxed. Not all at once. The first full day she was still careful, still a little watchful, helping with dishes before I asked and apologizing every time she needed something. By the second day, she was asking me where I kept the board games and whether we could get a dog someday, and could she call her friend Tatum from school because she promised to tell her something funny. I said yes to all of it, replayed Scrabble, and she beat me fair and square using the word quartz on a triple word score. We drove to a bookstore and I told her to pick whatever she wanted, and she picked 3 books and then asked if a 4th was too many, and I told her to get 5. We made tacos for dinner on the 3rd night, and she stood on a step stool at the counter and showed me what she'd learned about rolling the guacamole from a cooking class she'd apparently taken at school that I hadn't known about. I learned things about my granddaughter in those 4 days that I realized I'd been missing. She's funny, genuinely funny, with a dry delivery that catches you off guard. She loves maps. She has an atlas that she's apparently had for a year and has memorized whole sections of. She told me that when she grows up, she wants to work in a national park because she thinks someone should be in charge of making sure the animals are okay. She said this completely seriously, and I told her, also seriously, that was one of the best career plans I'd ever heard. On the 3rd night, she came downstairs after I thought she was asleep and sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Grandpa, is Mom mad at you?" I thought about how to answer that. "Your mom and I disagree about some things," I said. "That's something adults do sometimes, but that's not your problem to worry about. I don't want there to be fighting because of me." "There isn't going to be any fighting," I said. And I meant it, because I hadn't intended to fight about anything. I'd intended to be very, very clear. She looked at me for a moment. "Okay," she said, and she seemed to decide to believe me, which is one of the greater acts of trust I've been on the receiving end of. Garrett and Sasha arrived back home on a Sunday afternoon. He called me that morning and asked if they could come to my house directly rather than me bringing Maeve to theirs. I said that was fine. I think he knew that being on my ground was safer, that I was less likely to say things I couldn't take back if I was in my own kitchen. They arrived together. Sasha was wearing sunglasses she didn't take off immediately and carrying the kind of airport coffee that tells you the flight has been quiet and tense. Garrett looked tired. He hugged Maeve when she came downstairs and held on a little longer than usual, and I watched Sasha watch them from across the room with an expression I couldn't fully read. I'd asked Maeve to go to her room for a while. She had her books and she understood, better than she should have had to, that adults sometimes needed to talk. We sat at my kitchen table. No coffee this time. I didn't offer it. I'd spent the 4 days that were gone thinking carefully about what I was going to say and how I was going to say it. I talked to a family law attorney on Friday. Just a phone consultation, just to understand my standing. I'd also called my younger sister, who was a licensed social worker for 20 years before she retired, and she'd help me organize my thoughts. I started by telling Garrett that I loved him, and I wasn't going to change. Then I told them both, clearly and without any drama, exactly what I had found when I arrived at their house. The food situation, the nightlight that no one had replaced, the fear in Maeve's voice. The way she'd apologized for calling me at midnight because she thought she was being a burden. Sasha started to say something about how 9 is a developmentally appropriate age for. And I held up one hand. "I'm not finished," I said. She stopped. I told them that I had spoken with an attorney and that what they had done met the legal threshold for child endangerment in Tennessee, that I wasn't saying this to threaten them, that I was saying it because I wanted them to understand the actual weight of what had happened, not the version that felt easier to live with. I told Garrett that I had watched for 2 years as Maeve was managed instead of loved, that I understood Sasha had her own feelings and her own adjustments, and that I wasn't without empathy for how hard the transition had been. But that a child can tell, children always can tell, when they are not fully chosen, and that Maeve had been holding herself together in that house in ways that a 9-year-old should never have to. Sasha took off her sunglasses somewhere in the middle of that. She looked to the table. I said, "I'm asking you, directly and without any conditions attached, to get into family therapy, all 4 of you. A therapist who specializes in adoptive family dynamics. I will pay for it. I will drive Maeve to every session myself, if that's what it takes. That's not a request I'm making as a bonus option. That is what happens next." Garrett said yes before Sasha did. She said yes too, eventually, in the quiet that followed. It was a small yes, but it was real. I also told them that Maeve would spend every other weekend with me, starting immediately, and that this was not a negotiating point. Garrett nodded. Sasha looked at the table again. When they left, Maeve came downstairs and asked how it went. I told her it went fine. She studied my face the way she does when she's deciding whether to believe the simple answer. "Did they say I could keep coming here?" she asked. "Every other weekend," I said, "starting in 2 weeks." She nodded, slow. Then she said, "Can we play Scrabble again before I go home today?" We played 2 rounds. She won both of them and she was not even slightly gracious about it, which made me laugh harder than I had in months. Here is what I want to say, to anyone who might be listening. I am 61 years old. I have made plenty of mistakes as a father, more than I'll account for here. I was not always the most present man when Garrett was young, and that is something I have carried for a long time and tried to make right. But I know this. A child who is in your house, who sleeps under your roof, who calls you mom and dad, that child is yours. Not provisionally, not when it's convenient. Yours. Maeve came into my family 2 years ago with one backpack and the careful eyes of a child who had learned not to want too much. She didn't ask to be chosen. She didn't ask for any of this, and she deserves every single person in her corner using their full weight. The therapy started 3 weeks later. I drive Maeve to her individual sessions on Tuesdays after school. She's working with a woman who specializes in early childhood trauma, and she is, according to this woman, one of the most perceptive children she's worked with. I already knew that. The whole family goes on Thursdays. I don't ask Garrett what they talk about. That's not my business. What I know is that Maeve calls me every Sunday, voluntarily, to tell me about her week. She told me last week that she found a book about Yellowstone at the school library, and she'd like to visit someday. I told her I'd never been either. She said we should go together. I told her I'd start looking at dates. There are some things that happen in a family that you can't fully fix. You can only decide what you do next. I'm 61 years old, and I'm not naive enough to believe that one conversation around a kitchen table and some Thursday sessions straighten everything out permanently. But I know what I saw in the 4 days Maeve was at my house. I know what it looked like when a child stopped waiting for something to go wrong. When she stopped folding herself small to take up less space. When she put her head on my arm in a Waffle House booth and just slept. That's what I was fighting for. Not a dramatic confrontation. Not a moment where I got to be right. Just that. A little girl who knows she has someone fully, unconditionally, unreservedly in her corner. She has me. She's always going to have me. And she still owes me a rematch on Scrabble, which she's absolutely going to lose. I keep coming back to the moment Maeve said she didn't want to be a baby about it. She was 9 years old, alone in a dark house, surviving on crackers and peanut butter, and the thing she was most worried about was whether calling her grandfather made her weak. That didn't happen by accident. That's what a child learns when she's been quietly taught, over and over, that her needs are an inconvenience. What I did that night wasn't heroic. I drove 3 hours and picked up my granddaughter. Any decent person does that. What I've thought about since is everything that led to that phone call. All the small choices that Garrett and Sasha made over 2 years, each one seeming minor in isolation, each one adding to the weight that Maeve was carrying alone. Actions accumulate. The way you treat a child on an ordinary Tuesday shapes who that child becomes. There's no way around that, no shortcut past it. What you put in is what grows. I'm not a perfect man, and I'd never claim to be. I made my own quiet failures when Garrett was young. Too much time at the office, too little time on the floor with him. I know what it costs when a father isn't fully present. I've lived on the other side of that accounting, so when I sat across from my son at that kitchen table, I wasn't there to condemn him. I was there because I understood, maybe better than anyone, how easy it is to let the person in front of you, the one who needs you most, go unseen. And I understood that understanding it isn't enough. You have to actually do something about it. That's the part nobody talks about enough. Knowing what's right is only the first piece. The second piece is having the honesty to look at what you're actually doing, not what you intend, not what you tell yourself at the end of the day. Garrett knew, on some level, that leaving Maeve behind was wrong. He couldn't finish the sentence when I asked him what his plan was. That unfinished sentence told me everything. Intelligence without the courage to act on what you know is just a more sophisticated way of hiding. And then there's the third piece. The part that asks something of your bones, not just your brain. Getting in the car at midnight, sitting across from your son and his wife and saying the thing that needs to be said, clearly without softening it into something easier to swallow. Driving Maeve to therapy on Tuesday afternoons and sitting in the parking lot and waiting, and doing it again the following Tuesday and the one after that. That kind of steadiness isn't dramatic. It doesn't make for much of a story. But it's the only thing that actually changes anything. Maeve beat me at Scrabble twice. She has an atlas she's memorized. She wants to work at a national park someday because she thinks someone should be in charge of making sure the animals are okay. She told me that completely seriously, and I believed her completely. Because a kid who thinks that way, who extends her concern outward, to creatures that can't advocate for themselves, that kid is going to be fine. She already has the most important thing. She already knows what it means to care about something beyond herself. I just had to make sure she knew someone cared about her the same way. She knows now.